Hello, everybody, and welcome to So You Think You Can Rule Persia. Today, we have a different episode than usual, so we're not going through the rounds ranking our favorite kings of all, but we have a very special guest, which is David Chaffetz. So, David Chaffetz is an independent scholar with a lifelong passion for Middle Eastern and Inter-Asian history. He is a member of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs and author of A Journey Through Afghanistan and Three Asian Divas. He has traveled in Asia for over 40 years. And today he's here to talk with us about his new book, Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, The Horse and the Rise of Empires. It's really a great read, and in it he explores the impact of the horse on empires from antiquity, with the Achaemenids and Assyrians, all the way to the Mongols, Mughals, and even the Soviets. Throughout the podcast, we've had plenty of dealings with the people who inhabit the steppe and have had plenty of opportunity to meet the horse, especially in the case of warfare for our four main empires. So today we'll discuss many of these themes as they're presented in the book with David. But first, David, would you like to introduce yourself any further?
Good morning, Umberto. I'd just like to say that I have been following Iranian history with great interest since 1975, when I had an opportunity to study Persian and travel to Iran and live in Iran for about a half a year. I'm sad about what's going on in Iran today.
Yes.
And one of the things I hope that we'll all be able to go back to Iran.
Yeah, that would be lovely. Certainly, it would be a good occasion, better times. But yeah, in that case, then let's get started with some looks at the book. So just as an opening question to warm up, I'd like to talk about the book itself and what pushed you to begin writing. Did something in particular in your travels inspire this work, or what curiosity led you to this?
So after I lived in Iran, I had the opportunity to travel across Afghanistan by horseback for several months, which is actually the topic of the first book I wrote back in 1981 called A Journey Through Afghanistan. And that experience led me to understand how important horses are in the context of these countries bordering the steppe: Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, Russia. The horse plays a very special role. And for many years, I was observing this without really understanding what that role was, or what the mechanism was for the horse to play the role it did in the history of Eurasia. And at one point, I had enough time on my hands to really dive into it. And I found the story so compelling. One of my very good friends and someone I kick ideas around with said to me, that's a really good topic for a book. You should write that book. And so I did.
Great way to go about it, and came out very, very well. And okay, so to move on. So in your book, you describe the domestication of the horse in Asia, but you also mentioned that it originated in the Americas but went extinct there. So could you elaborate on the difference between these two scenarios and what this early domestication would have looked like?
Yeah, well, the thing to keep in mind is it's very much concomitant with climate change, with the Ice Age. So during the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, which is, let's say, 50,000 to 25,000 years ago, there was a kind of single ecological belt stretching from Alaska to Spain. And in that belt, which was cold but very grassy, we had big mammals. We had, the famous woolly mammoth and the woolly rhinoceros, the bison, but we also had the horse. And the Ice Age enabled the horse to migrate out of North America all the way to Spain. And when we look at cave paintings, the famous cave paintings in the south of France and in the north of Spain, the horse is one of the most commonly depicted animals. In fact, it's the single most commonly depicted mammal. So here you have the horse very widely spread across this big ecological zone. When the Ice Age ended, this zone contracted. And so with it, the habitat of the horse contracted. It disappeared in North America. It probably disappeared in Spain and France. Whether it disappeared because the habitat disappeared or whether it was hunted to extinction, I don't think we can be sure. But the basin of the homeland of the horse became the Eurasian steppe. And there were very few people in the Eurasian steppe originally. Over time, humans continued to hunt horses in the Eurasian steppe. At the same time, they had domesticated other livestock, such as goats, sheep, and cattle. So it was only a matter of time before they said, we can also domesticate horses and add them to our flocks. So I would say the initial reason for domesticating the horse was to add another very valuable animal to our livestock. But the big difference, and this is the fundamental thing that changes everything, you can herd sheep, goats, and cattle without riding them because they don't walk that fast. But the only way to domesticate horses, to herd horses, would be to ride them, to learn to ride them. And so riding came into existence as a necessity. And this completely changed life on the steppe and eventually life everywhere else across Asia and Europe.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you. That's very nice to see these differences here that we are. But yeah, as you mentioned that there were different types that sort of disappeared for the horse around. Do we know of any breeds that disappeared but were still extremely popular, like the Mesopotamian Kunga, for example?
So my feeling about breeds is that you can't really talk about breeds. A Kunga, if I remember, is a hybrid, right?
That's right, yes.
So it's not really a breed. It's simply the practice of creating mules out of onagers and onagers and horses.
I think it's onagers and horses, yes.
Right.
I remember.
The reason why they did that is because horses were a little bit domesticated and onagers were not, and so it produced an animal that was a little bit more malleable than an onager, which is a very ornery creature. So I think the kunga probably went out of existence simply because we hunted down and killed all the wild asses, so that in the place of kungas we have mules, which is basically the same thing, but with domesticated donkeys and not wild donkeys.
Mm-hmm.
All breeds have gone extinct. All ancient breeds have gone extinct. People who claim that the Ake Turkel horse from Turkmenistan or the Arab horse is a very ancient breed are not basing that on any scientific evidence. Until the 18th century, there were no breed books in Asia, no stud books in Asia. We know that people bred horses from far away with the local breeds, and there was no big focus on pure blood raising. So the breeds that we see today, and for example, the famous breeds of Iran today, probably don't go back further than the 18th century. Why do I say that? Because in Iran in particular, breeds tend to be the favorite horse of a particular tribe who live in a particular environment. And so they breed a horse which suits their particular needs. So for example, the Bakhtiari who live in the Zagros Mountains, their horses have to go up and down very treacherous trails. So they've bred a horse that is very good on mountain paths. Whereas the Turkmen in Gorgan in eastern Iran, they live in a very hot climate with a lot of desert, and so they bred a horse which can run very far on very little water. The point to keep in mind is that the Bakhtiari and the Turkmen themselves have not been in those places since the time of Cyrus. They come into those regions in historical times in the 18th century. And so it's starting from when they formed a society that they began to breed horses in those environments and creating the famous breeds of Iran today. So I would be skeptical of anybody saying that there's a particular breed in Iran who goes back to the time of Cyrus.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. So then in the book, once we've gone through the sort of domestication of the horse, you then go on to discuss the Santashta culture and their influence in spreading the use of the horse and the chariot in particular. So could you please describe this process and how much of this sort of Proto-Indo-European cultural tradition remains with us today?
Yeah, that's a really wide question. I think in the narrowest sense, we picked the Santashta culture to focus on because that is the earliest evidence we have of the recognizable chariot, which is to say a cart which has wheels with spokes and which was driven by horses. If you think about it, there are many chariots in the Middle East from an earlier period, but they don't have spoked wheels, they have solid wheels. And very often these vehicles would have been driven by oxen or eventually by kunga, as you mentioned, but not by horses. And so the Santosha chariots must have been extremely fast. We know they're very lightweight, and they contained a huge amount of sort of prestige accoutrements, brass tack and decoration and so forth. So we can imagine that the Santosha people represented a very evolved and kind of aristocratic cult of speed. And this chariot for display, chariot for hunting, chariot for racing, you see it. Where do we see it in Western culture? Well, very much it's the culture of the people in the Iliad, in Homer's Iliad.
Mhm.
When Achilles celebrates the funeral of Patroclus, there are chariot races in his honor. And this is something I think a very common part of the Indo-European peoples across Europe and also in India when they were going the other way. This is something they inherited from the Santashta culture. Is it still with us today? Well, you still have kart racing.
Yes.
Handicap likes going to the races to see kart racing, so that's the tradition of the Santashta people.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's very nice. And yeah, so one of the various uses of the chariot would be the military aspect of the horse itself. So there's a very broad field there, but how would you say that we went from chariots to heavy cavalry to finally using at the end of World War II, thereabouts, in the final cavalry charges?
So, again, going back to Homer's Iliad, you notice that the heroes, Hector, Patroclus, Achilles, they ride into battle on the chariot, but they apparently fight on foot. I also believe that in the Mahabharata, the great heroes of the Indian epic ride their chariots in battle. They fight on foot. They use the chariot as the battle platform also for shooting arrows, because they're heavily equipped with arrows. They would have 200 arrows in the chariot. So it is not, let's say, the chariot is not a combat sport. And if you think about it, it would be very difficult to have a chariot charge because they would all get in one another's way and they would probably smash one another up. Now, I believe there are instances where people did charge with chariot, but rare. And I think that was probably not the primary purpose of chariots. So then, if you go on, why do people give up chariots? It's simply because in warfare, they are not that maneuverable. There are many accounts of people getting injured just driving in the chariot before they even get into contact with the enemy. So when cavalry developed, which was the result of having bred more powerful horses to pull these chariots, and horses which were more kept their calm in war and could deal with the stress of combat. These sort of heavy duty horses then became suitable for horseback riding, and then cavalry developed. But again, originally the cavalry was primarily for mounted archers. The cavalry, pure shock cavalry, exists not very often in history. If you look at, for example, the Eurasian invasions of Western Europe attacking the Romans or attacking the Byzantines, look at pictures of these combats. The steppe invaders are very often depicted with bows and arrows. I don't think they're really charged. And charges have always been a little bit of a dicey thing because a well-disciplined infantry group with obstacles in front of them, if they don't turn and run, the charge makes no impact on them. So I think the charge is something that cavalry people always promoted as the decisive action in battle, but typically charges were only really effective at the conclusion of the battle in order to disperse the enemy and to make sure he didn't get away.
Mhm.
Most the most dangerous element of the steppe horsemen's power was the fact that they could encircle the enemy and attack him with arrows from a distance, and the enemy was trapped in kind of a noose from which he couldn't escape. And that's principally how the Iranians, the Parthians, for example, destroyed Crassus.
Yeah. And is there, well, just a bit at the side, what is the reason why eventually this dominance of the horse archer eventually disappeared? So, how was the Russian Empire able to eventually subjugate a bunch of these people.
Well, so horse art, if you look at the war between the Russians and the Iranians in the 1810 to 1820s, and there's a lot of depictions of this in Iranian painting, you notice that the Iranian cavalry continues to use horse arrows. So it remained a very dangerous arm in the hands of good cavalry. And cavalry in general didn't really lose its role on the battlefield. What happened is that much later, 100 years later, as we were able to replace horses with the internal combustion engine, the truck, the tank, and the airplane proved to be more economical and more deadly than cavalry. It took a long time for this transition to happen, but I would argue that if it had not been for the internal combustion engine, you would still be using cavalry because nothing else could provide you the mobility, the flexibility, the reconnaissance, all these things that cavalry did in warfare very effectively up until the 1920s.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Thanks.
And then back to why the Russians managed to beat the Persians in all these wars. Keep in mind that the Russian army was extremely ably aided by the Cossacks, and the Cossacks, for all intents and purposes, were equipped exactly like the Iranians. So you had steppe warriors from Iran, Turkoman tribes, fighting for the Shah, and you had Cossacks who lived on the steppe, who bred their own horses, who grew up in the saddle, fighting on the Russian side.
Yeah. So a little bit using their own weapons against them, trying to match
Exactly.
each other out.
Right.
Okay, yeah. And so I was also wondering, among Eurasia in general, were there particular horse breeds that were sort of more suited to war? Essentially, would a Mongol horse be different from a French horse? And what advantages would each have given?
So let's answer that by looking at Mongol horses versus Iranian horses, because I think that's an easy comparison to make. The big difference is that the Mongols privileged numbers over quality, and they privileged robustness over power, because in Mongolia, which is much colder than Iran, and where the pasturages are much less rich than Iran. And when I say Iran, I mean places like Azerbaijan. The horses have to be short, stocky, hardy, resistant to cold. And they're not very impressive beasts, but they're very resistant and they can go very far distances on little food. Iran has a tradition of raising powerful horses, which require much more food. People break them in much later in their development, at 3 years, for example, rather than breaking them in right away as the Mongols do. And so they grow taller. If you break in a horse too young, it will not grow to its full height. So Iranian horses are bigger, more powerful, more hungry. And the other big difference is that the Mongols rode geldings, horses which have been
Oh, I
castrated,
see.
and therefore much less prone to disease, much less prone to fighting among themselves, much easier to discipline. Iranian horse rode stallions. John Chaldin, the famous Franco-English traveler to Iran at the time of Shah Abbas, said that the Iranian horses were the most beautiful horses he had ever seen. And he noted the fact that the Iranian cavalry only mounted on stallions.
Right.
So they were much more warlike, much more powerful, but their range of operations would have been much smaller because they require a huge amount of food. And therefore, it wasn't for Iranians were not in the position to go off invading faraway countries, whereas the
Mhm.
Mongols could and did ride from Mongolia all the way to Iran and attack Iran. So there is a huge difference in the whole philosophy of horse breeding, what constitutes a war horse and what kind of warfare you're trying to engage in. If you look at the Western Europeans, a very, very few number of horses in Western Europe were bred to be big, powerful, and carry a fully armored mounted knight. I was reading the record lordly domains in the UK. They looked at 300 domains, And the 300 domains had a total of 2,400 horses, and only 15 of them were war horses.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
they were the Lamborghinis of the time. And I suspect the British had so few war horses. That's one reason why they chose to fight on foot at Agincourt and Clercy, because losing a horse in battle would have been a huge financial loss.
I see. Okay. So it was just such a massive investment that they couldn't afford to just
Indeed.
move on beyond that. And well, also just following up on this really quickly, you mentioned Mongols again. The Mongols did end up conquering Iran, as we
They did.
saw. Did they maintain their smaller gelding horses out of an affection for their tradition, or did they very rapidly adopt the traditions of their subject people?
Yeah, in Iran, the Mongols pretty much, well, the two things happened. First of all, the Mongols brought into Iran many, many Turks. The Turkish population of Iran today are the descendants of the people who came into Iran during the Mongol conquest. And so, to some extent, they replicated the steppe way of life in places like Azerbaijan, Gorgan in eastern Iran, parts of Sistan. Very different, though, from, for example, the Bakyars, who live in an environment which does not at all resemble Mongolia. Therefore, the Kurds, the Lurs, the Bakyars are not as influenced by Turco-Mongol equestrian traditions as the Azerbaijanis or the Turkmen. So I think it's a mix. The Turkmen tribes who represented the mainstay of the army of Shah Abbas and his successors would have had some aspects of Mongol art of horsemanship, but again, because they had these more powerful horses and those horses were quite prestigious, they definitely kept them.
And all right, so just returning on a more chronological point. So, how did steppe societies develop around the horse, and how did state formation appear in this context? Like, how do we get the first steppe societies, and how do they develop around and in collaboration with the horse?
So one of the characteristics of steppe society versus agricultural societies such as traditional Iran, China, India, is that people live with very low density. And nevertheless, they do have to protect themselves, their horses. The steppe is a fairly easy place to carry out horse stealing, bride stealing, which is still a big deal in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. It's a traditional way to obtain a bride. So I feel like the horse breeders had to self-organize themselves in a way that the agricultural populations of Iran, India, or China never had to do. And so they wound up with a society which was much flatter, if you like, less hierarchical, and more sort of voluntary submission. People submitted to a chief because he was competent, because he was fair, and he organized them in such a way that they felt safe, protected, and they could, pursue their livestock herding peaceably. And he would have been good at organizing hunts, which was a very important way of was and is still a very important factor in male bonding. But in those days, male bonding meant society. And eventually, he was an effective war leader, both defensive and offensive. So the whole society was sort of organized around the ability to hunt, to make war, and I guess I should also mention migration, which was a semi-military effort, sometimes coexisting with military events. This is totally different from the sedentary population of Iran who cultivated their land, lived in their village, paid taxes to the headman paid taxes to the governor paid taxes to the Shah. And compare and contrast the military capabilities of the two populations. When the Shah wanted to go to war to levy, to create an army from the peasant would have taken months, and the peasant had no particular military skills. Whereas when a Khan on the steppes wanted to invade Iran, all he had to do is give the word, and 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 horsemen would assemble, knowing exactly how to carry out a military campaign. So steppe society, I wouldn't say that the steppe people were more violent or more greedy or bloodthirsty
That's
than
right.
the average Iranian peasant. But the point is that their whole society was tuned toward mobility, the ability to carry out aggression. And for them, warfare was just the way of life.
And with all this mobility that you mentioned, was there enough of a cultural identity of different groups? So would an inhabitant of the steppe have believed, I am a Mongol part of this group, and there are other Mongols part of other groups? Or was it more a more limited identity where you are identifying with your immediate group as opposed to sort of a larger collective, such as the Turks, the Mongols?
Yeah, let's put it this way. The identities were very fluid and very opportunistic at times of chaos. So, for example, when when the Safavid Empire collapsed and there was basically a civil war in Iran going on for a century, many of the tribal groups split up, recombined, opportunistically leaders arose, organized the tribesmen into new formations. That's why I say that most of the tribes of Iran don't go back before the 18th century, because the 18th century was a period of tremendous upheaval. But when a charismatic, competent leader arose, he forged an identity around people. And as long as that tribe had some cohesion, people identified with the tribe. And over time, they forgot that they had ever belonged to any other tribe because, they were not literate people. So after two or three generations, they just said, well, I'm a Bakhtiari from this clan, and that was their identity, or I'm a Luri from this clan. And they gave themselves genealogies that made it seem like those tribes had been around forever. But of course, they're mostly no older than 200 years.
Yeah, so you'd mentioned it a little bit before, but having discussed steppe societies themselves, so how did they generally relate to the settled people of Eurasia? So we've seen in the podcast that in Iranian history, it's often antagonistic with the Hephthalites, the Parthians, the Turks, all
Right.
that. But was that always the case? Were there different relationships that were had?
They could certainly live in equilibrium. There was no particular reason why they're antagonistic. In the best case, they are ecologically in distinct niches. Iran has wonderful pasture land, which don't really receive enough water for growing crops, but they have enough water for grass. And there are areas, for example, mountainous areas where you can grow rice, where you can grow other crops. They get a lot of water, a lot of rain, like in Mazandaran. So there was no reason for the pastoralists to come butting into the life of the Gilakis. From time to time, these equilibriums were upset. There could be a period of a drought where there's not enough grass, so they're looking for they're trying to protect their herds. They may invade an area that's traditionally been used for growing crops, and so there are these tensions. But I find it really interesting what the British consul Tabriz at the end of the 19th century wrote that Iran has great pastures and it has huge livestock reserves. And it would be a shame, he wrote, if the government were to suppress the tribes and force them to settle down, because they would make lousy farmers and it would be a net loss to the Iranian economy. And of course, that's exactly what Reza Shah did. And I can only argue that Iran could have been providing meat to the entire Middle East in the same way that in the United States, Montana and Dakota are not used for farming but used for livestock raising. There was a lost opportunity, but instead Reza Shah impoverished the tribes, and there was no upside really.
And do you think that in an alternate world, this sort of more nomadic way of living would have been able to survive and thrive up to the modern day?
Well, why not? There are many countries which have extensive livestock resources. Australia, Brazil, Argentina, the United States, and Iran imports meat. So I'm sure that they could have preserved the livestock industry. The issue would have been how to do that while keeping the tribes under political control. That was the big issue. Because the tribes had this latent military capability, for Reza Shah, they were too dangerous to leave to their own devices. So it's a purely political decision, not an economic decision to eliminate the livestock herd way of life. And we see that the Soviets did exactly the same thing. The only country that didn't do this, by the way, was Afghanistan.
All right. And then, so going back to the past, we've seen that, well, one of the more important routes through the steppe was the Silk Road, or the horse road, as you call it in the book.
Mm.
Could you describe what the role of the horse and steppe people was in this and why you have this renaming to Horse Road?
Sure. I think it's important to keep in mind how important horses were in the trade patterns of the Eurasian steppe. The steppe itself was a great place to raise horses. There were 10 million horses on this steppe, half the world population of horses only on the steppe. And these horses were very good horses for a number of reasons. They were bred in their, if you like, they were bred in their native environment. So they were healthy. They had long-windedness. They were very diligent. They didn't suffer from some of the ticks that horses raised in stables or raised in adverse climate develop diseases and so forth. So you have a lot of wonderful, healthy horses. And on the other hand, you're surrounded by countries where you cannot breed good horses, China, India, primarily, and Iran. You can. So we'll put a parenthesis around Iran for a second. In China and India, you can't raise good horses, and for many, many years, people couldn't figure out why. Modern nutritionists have realized that when it rains a lot, the rain drains certain important nutrients out of the soil. One of the most important is selenium. Selenium is a trace mineral which is required for the development of horses so that they develop big, powerful hearts and also makes them taller. And they need selenium on a daily basis for their metabolism. So a selenium poor environment like China and India will have kind of puny horses that cannot run very far or very fast. Therefore, China and India imported in huge numbers horses every year for their military purposes. In some eras, these respectively imported 100,000 horses a year. If you look at the cost of those horses, what they typically would have paid for in silver coin, it's a very, very significant trade element, and probably the single biggest trade item that was traded back and forth between the steppe and the settled countries. The Iranians also participated in this trade. They were not an importer of horses. They were big exporters of horses. The Iranians exported horses as far away as China. They exported horses extensively to India. And again, it was a major source of trade. Now, on the back of this trade, obviously other things were traded. The Chinese paid for the imports of horses for a long time with silk, which is why you find so many swathes of silk buried in the desert in Western China. The 19th century explorers and archaeologists who opened up this territory to Western knowledge were really struck by the amount of silk they found there, and so they called it the Silk Road. But of course, everyone always knew it obviously wasn't just silk. There were precious stones, there were spices, there were all kinds of aromatics and things that are specialties of different regions. By the way, the one thing you could also call it is the slave road, because all these nations were huge slave traders up until the Russian conquest. One of the major reasons for the Russian conquest was to put an end to the slave trade. Horses and slaves are quite complementary because you go to war, you sell horses, you go to war, and then during the war you get a bunch of slaves, and you sell the slaves. And then afterwards, go to war again. So a lot of these people were both major buyers and sellers of horses and victims of kidnapping or importers of slaves. So this was the economic context of this zone in between the empires, the settled empires of Asia. And I thought it'd be interesting to call it the horse road to draw attention to the role of the horse in this trade and de-emphasize luxury goods like silk or jade, amber.
Yeah, that's right. So it was just a large majority, or at least a significant proportion of it, was this actual transfer of horses. And I'm just curious because I've been recently reading a book called Slaves on Horses, which was essentially about, for example, the Mamluk slave armies that were carried on throughout Eurasia. And could you perhaps comment on how this relationship happened between these sort of slave armies that were very significant in the later Middle Ages, for example, and how that connected to this trade?
Yeah, so starting back at the beginning of the Arab conquest of Iran, obviously the army was primarily Arabs. Over time, the Arab Bedouins settled down in Iran and became settled people. And the Caliph of Baghdad had to recruit mercenaries or slaves to constitute his army. And it was an era where there was a massive migration of the Turkish peoples from what today's Mongolia to the frontiers of Iran, and there was a very large trade in mercenaries and slaves, such that the Abbasid army was essentially composed of Turkish soldiers. And that continued for a very long time. Hafez's Turkish Shirazi would have been one of these military Turks. Whether he was
Hmm.
free or a slave was is not known. But I think that it's hard to make a distinction between a mercenary and a slave in a society like that where no one is really free. I mean,
Right.
everyone serves and everyone exists at the pleasure of the caliph or the sultan. So I can't give you a really good definition of the difference, but the permeability of the border between the steppe and Iran and other parts of the Middle East was such that these steppe warriors became the major military force in Iran, Syria, and Egypt. At some point in Iran, instead of undergoing slavery or becoming mercenaries, they simply came in on their own and took over. That's Seljuks.
Yes.
But the Khwarezm Shahs were descended from slaves. And the slaves basically took over the domain of Khwarezm, and became the rulers. And this happened very, very frequently in Delhi. The Mamluks, the slave soldiers, basically took over from the Ghurids, and one dynasty after another in Delhi were Mamluks. And of course, the Mamluks took over in Egypt by the same token after serving the Ayyubids, and lasted until their defeat by Selim the Grim in 1517. So it's a very long history. The thing we have to keep in
Mhm.
mind is all these Mamluks, whether they're in Delhi or whether they're in Cairo, they're all no more than one generation removed from horse breeders on the steppe.
All right. I'm very surprised, honestly. I'd never made that connection.
Yeah, they're
Interesting.
Kipchak Turks. And they were recruited by the caliphs, by the sultans, by Shahs of Iran, specifically because they were born in the saddle. So
Hmm.
then they received additional training. They were converted to Islam, and before the masses of Turks became Muslim, they were converted to Islam. They learned to read and write. They learned fine arts. They were elevated to high positions in court. But the fundamental thing they knew how to do is they knew how to ride a horse since before they learned to walk. To walk.
That's always very impressive as a
It's
fact.
very impressive. And contrast that with the chivalry of Western Europe. In Western Europe, to become a knight, you had to apprentice yourself as a page. And then from a page, you had to become a squire. And these stages of initiation were all about learning the art of horsemanship and
Hmm.
fighting. Whereas the Kipchak Turks could probably fire, I'm sure the Kipchak Turks could fire arrows from their bow on horseback at a gallop from age 5 or 6 on.
Yeah, wow. That's always very, very impressive to hear. And yeah, so also speaking of these trade routes, so with this trade comes cultural exchange and exchange of information. So, what generally was transmitted along this sort of steppe route, and how did information on horse breeding, for example, spread across Eurasia, or was any other knowledge perhaps spread across Eurasia?
Yes, obviously, a lot of cultural things spread across Eurasia, partly related to horses, partly not. So if we look at horses, practical things like the development of the saddle, stirrups, which probably emerged in northern China in the 5th century, were transmitted to Europe by the Avars, who invaded
Mhm.
Central Europe and threatened the Frankish Empire in the 8th century, 7th, 8th century. Religion is the thing that comes to my mind most firmly as being
Right.
transmitted. The Kushans, who were a Scythian nation that settled in northern India, adopted Buddhism very enthusiastically. Many of the really beautiful um, statues of the Buddha made in this beautiful gray schist that you see a lot in Pakistan in the Lahore Museum. They are probably the ones who brought Buddhism to China. A lot of the original Buddhist scriptures were written for the Kushans, and then they were trading with China, and so brought the good word into Western China. And the first pagoda in China is the so-called White Horse Pagoda, which is at the very frontier between the steppe and China. in Luoyang, and that commemorates the arrival of the Buddhist scriptures in China. Of course, through the communication back and forth between Iran, India, and China, the Christian religion also penetrated far into China. And we forget that in the time of the Tang Dynasty, there were many, many churches in the Chinese capital of Xi'an, as well as Zoroastrian fire temples, as well as Buddhist temples. And what's interesting is that today, only Buddhism survives in China. The indigenous Chinese church has disappeared. Zoroastrian churches have disappeared. But in Tang Dynasty times, when China was very open to the steppe, all these important, I should mention Manichaeism as well, all these
Mhm.
important religious schools, many of which came from Iran, were common in the Chinese capital.
Yeah, I was very surprised how Manichaeism, though originating in Iran as a mixture of many different things, but there are some sort of descendant branches in China still to this day that exist in minor forms. But yes.
The story is, and I've asked experts on this, and the jury is out, but the story is that the Ming Dynasty, which succeeded the Mongol dynasty in China in 1368, that the Ming dynasty is an offshoot of a eclectic religious sect that was which was, let's say, in its origin inspired by Manichaeism.
Oh, really? I'd not heard that. That would be very interesting. That'd be nice for it to be. Okay, great. And well, we had already touched on this a little bit before, but if you could expand on it more, what are the main differences between cultures regarding the actual breeding of horses? So, again, you mentioned how China isn't a great environment for that, but they went out to seek out the heavenly horses over in Bactria during the Hellenistic period. And, well, how did the actual breeding of horses vary between different areas?
So the Chinese were dependent on bringing horses from the steppe zone for their cavalry. And I would say they really went whole hog because not only did they bring the horses, but over time they also brought a very large number of steppe people themselves into northern China to run this enormous bureaucracy required to field in Tang Dynasty times 700,000 cavalry of 700,000 troopers, which probably required about 2 million horses to keep them to keep the whole system going. It's an extraordinary number. And this is why you find in those Tang Dynasty tombs so many portraits of Westerners, of Turks, with prominent beards and facial features, which are quite different from that of the Chinese. And their clothes, of course, they wear kind of Phrygian caps and they wear pants.
Mhm.
Remember, the Chinese in those days did not wear pants, but all these figures you see wearing pants are, of course, horsemen. So the Chinese imported whole in one piece the Turco-Mongol tradition of horsemanship. They rode like the Turco-Mongols. They had the same games. They had all the traditions in the imperial stables would have been very much reflected the Turks, keeping in mind that several of the Chinese dynasties had in part steppe antecedents. It's said that the Tang Dynasty, on maybe the maternal side, were
Mhm.
originally related to the Khagans of the Turks. And in those days, the Chinese were not fussed by this. I think the trauma of being conquered by the Mongols made them much more sensitive to the difference between being a steppe person or being a Han Chinese person. And
Mhm.
so over time, that China defined itself more specifically as being distinct and being Chinese and not being from the steppe. And they created this whole concept of conquest dynasties versus indigenous dynasties. But if you look carefully at that distinction, it doesn't always hold up so well,
Yeah.
particularly before the Mongols. That's for the Chinese. For the Indians, in India, what basically happened is there they didn't bring the Turco-Mongols in so much as they brought in the Afghans. The Afghans migrated into northern India and formed a sort of a natural military class of people who understood horses, who raised horses, who traded in horses, and who ruled many of the states of northern India for many centuries. And they stayed in India for generations, and there are effectively towns in India like Bawalpur, where until 1947, the ruling classes were Afghans.
Mhm.
They were 500 years in India, but they still considered themselves originally from Afghanistan. And again, the fact that these people could stay in power for so long, it doesn't reflect some kind of, we're Afghans, we're better than anyone else. But the fact is that they fulfilled a very important role because they were the intermediary between the steppe, which had the horses, and the Indians who didn't have the horses. And
Right.
that gave them a very important social and economic position. Iran, because they had a deep tradition, equestrian tradition, there was no voluntary importation of a new caste of people. But on the other hand, when the Mongols came, they did bring several 100,000 families of Turco-Mongols, and that gives you the Turco-Mongol legacy in Iran.
Right. And well, to follow up on that, what happens when a horse-based steppe society becomes settled? So, such as like the Parthians, the Ilkhans in Iran, or the Yuan or Qing in China. What happens to that society? How does it transform in this new environment?
Yes. It does seem to be that there was a playbook, and some people read the playbook and they tried to avoid following the playbook. They never seem to be able to do it because here's what happened. The ruling class gravitates towards the greatest sources of centralized wealth and power. So eventually they wind up settling in cities. Initially, there's always some protests that we're not going to settle in cities. We're going to live in tents. We're going to travel around on our domains in tents and meet all the herdsmen, and nothing changes in our way of life. But after 2 or 3 or 4 generations, it seems almost inevitable that all these supreme khans wind up settling down in cities. And the minute they do that, their loyalties change from trying to promote the livestock raising people to trying to promote the peasant farmers. The peasant farmers are a more reliable source of tax revenue than the livestock people. The peasant farmers are more easily controlled than the livestock raising people.
Mhm.
So it just seems inevitable that after 3 or 4 generations, the rulers wind up taking the side of the settled people against the herders. And at that point, the herders look for someone else to lead them. They revolt, they migrate away, they leave the descendant of the original pastoralist Khan in the lurch, and he gets attacked by another new pastoralist Khan, and he
Right.
eliminated. And that basically explained an awful lot of dynastic changes in Asia.
Yeah, that certainly. There's often this cycle of rulers becoming too settled, and then eventually they're attacked by the next group over, and that cycle continues on until.
But see, the mechanism is important. It's not that the new guy starts from a clean slate. Usually, what happens is the old livestock herders rally to the new guy.
Mhm.
He doesn't conquer them, he simply seduces them away from the loyalty to the original dynasty. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how identities are fluid. They're sufficiently
Yes.
fluid that they will. Look what happened to the Safavid dynasty in Iran. They're a Turkoman dynasty. They were put there by the Turkomans. They ruled pretty much for the Turkomans for several generations. But by 1720, when the Afghans invaded Iran, the Turkmen beys didn't lift a finger to save the Safavid dynasty until it was too late. So that's a perfect example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point to make. Yeah. And yeah, so moving on, throughout history, what have been the main contributions of horses in society, and how do you envision a society that didn't end up domesticating horses or hunted them to extinction or something like that? Do you think there is any other animal around in the world, such as the camel or the dromedary, that could fill that cultural niche that the horse occupies? Or do you think that it's just too special an animal to be replaced this way?
So let's inventory the important animals that we domesticated and that sort of changed our lives. And I'll give you an example. Chickens didn't change our life because
Mhm.
we could hunt them. We had ducks, we had geese. although the chicken is a relatively recent domestication and probably came from Iran in Sasanian times,
All right.
it didn't change civilization. Why did horses change civilization? Well, the first animal that changed our civilization was the dog, because in the Ice Age period, the modern humans of the Pleistocene did not have the benefit of dogs for hunting, so hunting was very, very difficult. The minute we domesticated the dog, our hunting capabilities expanded greatly and it changed our life. So the dog was
Right.
an amazing contributor to our modern way of life. High calorie, high everything. The horse provided mobility. No other animal provided mobility. On horseback with relays of horses, for example, the Persian post could send a message famously from Persepolis to Sardis in Anatolia in 2 weeks, whereas it would have taken a human being 4 months to do the same.
Yeah.
So it's this mobility and connectivity which changes everything. It also brings nations in contact with one another that otherwise would not have been in contact with one another. While I was writing this book, I was amazed at how constant the relations have been between China and Iran. They're not
Right.
contiguous. They basically never had a common border, but the Chinese, way into the 18th century, had a bureau for translating Persian diplomatic documents into Chinese because these two states were in constant diplomatic contact for more than 1,000 years. That's because of the horse. If we look at parts of the world where the horse was not available for different reasons, North and South America, Australia, Africa south of the Sahara, what you see is that the amount of contact between different nations was not very great. So, for example, in the Western Hemisphere, you have various civilizations which attain quite extraordinary degrees of urbanism and technicity. Uh, the American Indians of the Mississippi Valley, the different peoples of Mexico,
Yeah.
the Incans, the Mayans. But what's interesting is they never contacted one another. Well, how
Hmm.
would they have gotten to one another? There was no way for them to have sustained contact over long distances. The same about the peoples south of South Saharan Africa. It was very difficult for West Africans and East Africans to have any relationship because there was no way for them to be in contact. Now, in that case, it's also the point that the geography didn't allow them to do that, but the geography also meant there would be no horses because horses
Right.
couldn't
Cool.
live in such an environment. So I would say that the unity of civilization, if you call it that, in Eurasia, across Eurasia, between China and Europe, including India and Iran, is really due to this equestrian asset which existed and which was exploited by all those countries, which eventually led to all of them having deep diplomatic relations, cultural relations, military relations between them.
Okay. Very nice. Thank you. And well, sort of as a counterpoint to this, we get to the sort of twilight of the horse, let's say. With the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the modern world, the horse has become more and more limited in its societal role. As you mentioned before, the combustion engine took up a lot of the work that the horse had. So, could you elaborate? Well, first of all, a bit. What did it look like while this transformation was ongoing? Like we went to a world where it was 100% horses to when it was 90% combustion engine. So, how did that transition look? And how do you see the role of the horse in the future?
Yeah, it's very interesting how quickly this transition started. It started with the bang, then there was something of a tail, and now we're
Mm-hmm.
really, really at the end of the tail. So, talking about the bang, as you probably know, there were more horses in New York, Paris, London, Berlin in 1900 than there were in 1800 because these cities were bigger, there was more trade,
Mm-hmm.
there was more industry. Trade and industry required transportation, and so the cities became full of horses, which was a significant challenge in terms of feeding them, in terms of disposing of their carcasses, in terms of disposing of their waste. So when the automobile was invented, it took off like wildfire simply because it doesn't get sick, it doesn't make a waste, the lifetime cost of a car is much, much lower than the lifetime cost of the horse. I know this from personal, well, family experience because in 1900, my family had, my father's family sold furniture and they had a cart to deliver the furniture to customers. And my father was responsible for getting up in the morning and feeding the horse and cleaning the horse. And of course, so the day that the family bought a Model A truck was a great day in the life of my father as a young boy. And there was no romance or nostalgia for that horse. They were
See.
really glad to be shot of him. So in urban centers, mechanized transport took off like a rocket. It was much more difficult to replace cavalry with mechanized means because of the scale. The Russians started World War I with 260,000 cavalry. So it would have been very difficult for the Russians in any short period of time to replace their horsepower with mechanized forces. So the transition away from cavalry took quite a long time to be completed, and it wasn't really completed until the end of World War II. But the writing was on the wall after World War I already. One of the British cavalry experts wrote an op-ed piece for the Times of London where he pointed out that it was only a matter of time before the tank and the truck would replace cavalry. It would take time because the industrial capacities of the UK were not adequate to replace all the horses, but it would happen. And the Western powers, UK and the United States, entered World War II fully mechanized, no horses. The Eastern powers, Russia, Soviet Union, for example, and even Nazi Germany had to extensively rely on horses because, of course, they were second-rate industrial powers and they didn't have the ability to produce the tanks and the trucks that they needed. And they never did. And they never did, interesting enough. The Russian army was the Soviet army was mainly mechanized by the effort to the United States Lend-Lease.
I see.
So after World War II, horses were clearly of not great use for civil purposes, of no use for military purposes. And throughout the 50s, they lost their role in agriculture. So people tend to be interested in things where they can make money or achieve power. And this is particularly true of men versus women. So if you look at the equestrian competitors at the Olympics, you see that in the 1950s and 60s, the vast majority of competitors were men. If you look at the Olympics in Paris last year, 70% of the competitors were women. So men have kind of abandoned equestrian arts because horses no longer represent a ticket to becoming a general or becoming a president or conquering an empire.
Sure.
Whereas the horses' great beauty, their empathy as animals, their sociability has a great appeal to women, and it has become basically a female domain, which is maybe not a bad thing because women don't ride them into combat and don't whip them and don't turn them into horse meat. So for the horses, it's probably a good thing that they're now in the care of great female equestrians and no longer being used for war fodder.
All right. Thank you very much. That was all very interesting. And yeah, this is the end of the questions that we had so far. I don't know if there's something in particular that you would like to add, but
Well, I've enjoyed talking to you, Umberto, and I think the questions are very pertinent. And the fact is, sadly, we could go on all night, but I'm not sure anyone would listen to us for the rest of the night. So I'll hand it back to you.
That's not fair enough. But yeah, if people are interested and this has whet your appetite, then you can definitely get Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, The Horse and the Rise of the Empire by David Chaffetz at the link below. There will be a link in the description of the episode or on the social media where we'll be posting this. So if you want to go have a look there, and you can order it at your own independent bookstore if you like, which is always a nice thing to do. Well, yeah, then thank you very much, David. This has been a pleasure. So we hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye, Umberto. Thank you.